Dr. Rigby, we have a man in his 50s here on site. He's inebriated and fell down the stairs in that local hotel they often house the drunkards in.
Hello, welcome to Dear Daughters of God. My name is Stephanie Eccles. I'm so glad you're here. This is episode 27. Emergency brain surgery with only a book. You won't believe what happens next. I am a retired school administrator, natural storyteller, and I am a daughter of God. Now I tell the stories of our lives from the perspective of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Welcome, dear daughters of God. I address you that way because that's what you are to Him. To our Heavenly Father, you are dear. While you're here, please like and subscribe to the Dear Daughters of God channel because we like having you around. I would like to dedicate this episode to my dear father, Odell Franklin Rigby, who passed away in the year 2018. This is the month of July, and it's his birthday month, which is fitting because he was such a patriotic man. I want to share one of his favorite, absurdly amusing stories. Then, as my father served in the Army for much of his life, we will reflect back, way back, on the glorious cause of America. Let's go back in time to 1937. We're coming to the end of the Great Depression. My father, Odell Franklin Rigby, is born on July 5th in Idaho Falls to Afton Odell Rigby and Elmer Clark Rigby. He's their only child, but Elmer was a widower and had 3 children from a previous marriage. Odell, yes, my grandmother named him after her maiden name. Odell was raised in Palo Alto, California, Logan, Utah, and eventually Salt Lake. He grew up to be very tall, all of 6'7". Everywhere I went with my dad, people would look at him starting at his toes and follow his tall body up to the top of his balding head. And then they would say, "How tall are you?" And he would smile and say in a modest way, "I'm 6'7". Now you might think, give the boy a basketball. But no, that did not fit my father. He much preferred chess. He was an intellectual, specifically a scientist. He graduated as a valedictorian from East High School in Salt Lake City and then went on to the University of Utah and graduated from medical school there as the president of a senior class with honors in 1964. He took a break from his university years to serve a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Australia, and that's where he met my mother. They were both Aussie missionaries. I've talked about my mom in more detail in episodes 1 and 2. This was at a time when U.S. troops were at war in Vietnam. It was time for Odell to serve in the Vietnam War. He was stationed at Letterman's Hospital at the Presidio in San Francisco. His military training included Airborne Ranger Special Forces and Flight and Battalion Surgeon training. And this is where my parents' first 2 daughters were born. They were twins. After that, they were stationed in Germany. He got to take his whole family because it wasn't within Vietnam. In Germany, he was the commander of the 10th General Dispensary in Frankfurt. And this is where I was born, the 3rd daughter. In 1969, he was able to return home with his young family to Salt Lake City, and now he could begin his residency in neurology. He was required first to do a couple of different rotations in general surgery. Neurosurgery would be his first rotation. There are usually more than one resident in each field. But in this circumstance, my father was the only resident, which meant he was on call every weekend and every weeknight. He had just started this residency and had not yet received his first lesson in neurosurgery. It was late on a Saturday night, and he got a call from the emergency room.
Dr. Rigby, we have a man in his 50s here on site. He's inebriated and fell down the stairs in that local hotel they often house the drunkards in.
My father said, I see. I'll be right there. Go ahead. Start his lab work, please. Thank you, Jean. He arrived at the emergency room and examined the patient. He found that he had a subdural hematoma of the brain. This is bleeding underneath the skull, and if it's not released, can cause death. My father called the chief of neurology. Hello, Chief. We have a 50-year-old man here. He is inebriated. He fell down the stairs and has a subdural hematoma on his head. What would you like me to do for him, sir? The chief said, I'll be right there. In the meantime, Odell, you go to my office. To the bookshelf in the top left, you find the book called Simple Neurological Procedures, and look up the chapter called Subdural Hematomas. Read that chapter and take the book with you to the operating room. My father did just what he was told. He found the book on simple neurological procedures and read the chapter on subdural hematomas. He took the book with him back to the corridor just outside of the surgery room. The patient was ready for the operation. He called the chief. Hello, Chief. I found that book on simple neurological procedures. I've read this chapter on subdural hematomas and found it interesting. The patient is ready to go. Matter of fact, we're outside the operating room, and how would you like me to proceed, sir? The chief said, That's fine. That's fine. I'll be right there. I'm on my way. Go ahead, take the patient into the operating room. They'll put him to sleep, and you start with the shaving of the head and cleaning of the skin and diagramming the scalp, and follow the procedures in the book. So he did just as he was told. The patient was under anesthesia. Odell shaved his head, cleaned the scalp, and diagrammed just as the book described. He then got the scalpel and cut the skin and peeled the skin back off the skull. Now he was to drill into the skull. This was 1970, and they did not have a power drill. They used a carpenter's hand drill. Now this is what it looked like. The middle part of the carpenter's hand drill is like a coffee grinder, but it's actually a cranking handle. They call it that. You put one hand on the middle cranking handle and the other above it on the second handle, which is held stationary. And at the bottom is the drill bit that cuts the hole. The middle hand turns and turns the handle around. Now it takes a while to crack a man's skull. At this point, the nurse said, I'm feeling sick. Odell said, Would you like to have someone replace you? No, I'll be fine. Odell went on drilling by turning and turning and turning the hand drill. He separated the skull, and the brain was now exposed. He saw the subdural hematoma and went to cauterize it. All of his attention was on this task. At this point, the nurse pulled down her mask and vomited into the brain cavity. When pressurized fluid goes down, it also ricochets back up. Odell shot straight up in complete shock. He called out, with vomit dripping down his goggles. Oh, get the chief on the line. Get the chief on the line. Chief, he said. Chief, I have shaved the man's head and diagrammed and peeled the skin back and drilled holes into the skull and separated the skull, and the brain is exposed. Oh, and the nurse vomited into the brain, sir. The operating room was in silence, waiting for the chief's answer, and nothing was said. Odell said, Chief,
Did you hear me, sir? The chief said. She did what? She vomited into the brain, sir. I cannot believe this. I have never in all my years of medical practice heard or seen such a ridiculous result as this. How did that happen? How did you let that happen, Odell? Odell said, Chief, what would you like me to do, sir? With exasperated breath, the chief said, Douse the brain with saline water, then put in rubber drains. We usually don't use rubber drains in the brain, but we'll have to use rubber drains at this point. Yes, put in rubber drains, then close the skull. Put them on high levels of antibiotics. I'll have to go straight to the ICU. I'm on my way. Odell doused the brain with saline water, put rubber drains into the brain, and closed the scalp. When the patient was in the ICU, Odell fell asleep for a couple of hours. Early in the morning, the chief arrived. They went together to do rounds. They visited the patient. He had a 105-degree temperature. The chief said, He'll never make it. My father, Odell, felt horrible remorse that this surgery had ended in such a way. He stayed with the patient and explained what had happened and apologized to him and told him that he did everything he could to save his life. He continued to visit the patient every day. 2 weeks later, the patient, now fully healed, walks out of the hospital. The chief said to Odell, You know, if he'd been the president of a bank or some other job with great responsibility, he would have never made it out of here. But being that he held no responsibilities and he was so pickled, he walks out of here just like that. Wouldn't you know it? My father loved humor. He had a dry sense of humor. He would teach us how to be like our Savior through example and sharing life stories like this one that occurred during his residency as a urologist. He did not weary of good works. In the Book of Mormon, in the Book of Alma, chapter 37, verse 34, it says this, quote, Teach them to never be weary of good works, but to be meek and lowly in heart, for such shall find rest to their souls, unquote. During Vietnam, my father received biomedical warfare training. He was advised to stay within the military because if there were ever another war, he would be called to serve in that war. He did just that by joining the Army Reserves. He had a private urology practice, but also stayed in the Army Reserves. In 1991, he put his medical practice on pause as he was called to serve full-time during the U.S. conflict in Kuwait, known as Desert Storm. By the time he retired, my father was a full-bird colonel. He was grateful to be an American veteran, which leads me to reflect on the Revolutionary War, or as those that were involved in this conflict call it, the glorious cause of America. Much of what I share today comes from the award-winning biographer David McCullough and his book, 1776. He points out, if we love or even benefit from the freedoms of living in America, we should recognize where these freedoms came from and how we came to obtain these gifts of freedom. For instance, the freedom of speech, or the freedom of religion, and the freedom of thought, to think as we would like to think. How did this all come about? Did you know that those men and women involved in the glorious cause of America were young? They were not experienced revolutionaries. They were winging it. It's easy for us to see them as figurines in a costume pageant.
That's how they're presented to us so often. But they were real people living in their present time. They didn't know what the end result would be. American history books had not been written. They were forming American history within their own lives, many of them not even realizing how significant their actions would be on our lives. The glorious cause of America was a young men and young women's cause, a long, drawn-out cause, that is. It lasted for 8 years, 4 months, and 15 days. It started on April 19th, 1775, and went till September 3rd, 1783. Yes, 8 years, 4 months, and 15 days. So, officially, it's called the Revolutionary War. What is a revolutionary, or what does it mean? Well, revolutionary means involving or causing a complete or dramatic change. Or a revolutionary is one involved or one causing a complete or dramatic change. Let's take a closer look at some of those people involved in the Revolutionary War. The greatest, most famous one. Let's start there. George Washington became our first president. He was 43 years old and the oldest of the bunch at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. He was the general of the Continental Army. That's what they called our army, the American Army, the Continental Army. John Adams, he eventually became the second president of the United States. He was 40 years old. During the Revolutionary War, he went to France and Holland and negotiated the Treaty of Peace, which led to the end of the War of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, he was 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Benjamin Rush, he was the leader of the anti-slavery movement. He was just 30 years old. So this gives you an idea of how young these revolutionaries really were. And again, they were not experienced revolutionaries. They had never been involved in a revolution before. Abigail Adams was a very influential woman. Now, in that day and age, women had to influence the community through their husbands. She was an ideal influence of women during the glorious cause of America. She writes to her husband, John, in Philadelphia. I think her writing gives us just a tiny glimpse of how difficult it was to survive during the period of the Revolutionary War. She says this, quote, "Posterity who are to reap the blessings will scarcely be able to conceive the hardship and sufferings of their ancestors." Unquote. Let's look at a pivotal moment during the Revolutionary War. Now, this occurred early on during the Revolutionary War, within the first 2 years. This is after General Washington had directed them in the crossing of the Delaware. And they'd done it successfully, and they'd won the battle in Trenton, which was an amazing feat, because here they are, so poorly trained, raggedly dressed, and meagerly weaponized, and they're fighting against the greatest army of the world, the British Empire, known as the Redcoats. But they win, and although it was a small battle, over in just 45 minutes, it was such a morale boost. That happened on December 25th, the evening of Christmas, 1776. Let's go a few days later to December 31st, 1776. As it happened, all of the men in the army, and there were not that many at this time, were due to have a completion of their enlistment, so they could just walk home freely and without problem. And they had every motivation to do so. There was so much sickness. More soldiers died from sickness than they did from battle. They were starving to death. They were freezing to death. They had every reason, in addition to those red coats they were fighting against, every reason to want to go home. It was George Washington's responsibility to change their minds. How would he motivate them? On this day, December 31st, 1776, he calls all of his soldiers out and he offers them a $10 bonus in addition to their pay if they will re-enlist for 6 months. Now, $10 doesn't seem like much, but it really is significant to add that to a man's salary at that time period. Now, George Washington understood the importance of leadership. He wasn't called to be the general because of his experience in running a revolution. He had never done so. He was called because of his great character and his integrity. And he understood how important it was to look like a leader. So he dressed in a splendid uniform and rode an immaculate white horse. He loved the theater and Shakespeare, so he understood how to look and act the part. And he said to his men, "Soldiers, I will offer you a $10 bonus if you will just stay for 6 more months. In addition to your pay, you'll get this $10 bonus. Please stay and fight with us." He asked them to step forward if they were willing to stay. Once the drum rolled, step forward. The drum rolls, and not one man steps forward. George Washington turns on his horse away from the soldiers and rides away. Now we know for a fact that George Washington is a man of prayer, and I believe he rode off to gather his courage and to seek guidance from the Lord. He was not gone long, for he came back with these words. He spoke in a very affectionate manner. He said this, quote, "My brave fellows, you have done all I asked you to do, and more than can be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake, your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. You have worn yourselves out with fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you. If you consent to stay 1 month longer, you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country, which you probably can never do under any other circumstances." David McCullough, the author of 1776, interprets General Washington's Re-enlistment Speech so well. Quote, "In other words, you are fortunate. You have a chance to serve your country in a way that nobody else is going to be able to do. Everyone else is going to be jealous of you, and you will count this the most important decision, the most valuable service of your lives." Unquote. With that interpretation, listen to General Washington's speech one more time. "My brave fellows, you have done all I asked you to do, and more than can be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake, your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. You have worn yourselves out with fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you. If you consent to stay 1 month longer, you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country, which you probably can never do under any other circumstances." General Washington then motioned for the drum roll. The drum rolled, and men began to step forward, one after another. And this made it so the glorious cause of America, the Revolutionary War, could continue and eventually win America's independence. As I learned about the fathers and mothers of the American Revolution, I was reminded of the prophecy given by President Spencer W. Kimball in 1979. It was the prophecy about the impact of future covenant-keeping women on the future of the Lord's church. I began to draw parallels between the American Revolutionaries and the future generation of covenant-keeping women. To better understand my line of thought, listen to this quote by President Russell M. Nelson. This was given in 2015 in his talk, A Plea to My Sisters. At the time, he was the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. President Nelson says this, quote, 36 years ago, in 1979, President Spencer W. Kimball made a profound prophecy about the impact that covenant-keeping women would have on the future of the Lord's church. He prophesied, quote, much of the major growth that is coming to the church in the last days will come because many of the good women of the world will be drawn to the church in large numbers. This will happen to the degree that the women of the church reflect righteousness and articulateness in their lives, and to the degree that the women of the church are seen as distinct and different in happy ways from the women of the world, unquote. President Nelson goes on to say, my dear sisters, you who are our vital associates during this winding up scene, the day that President Kimball foresaw is today. You are the women he foresaw. Your virtue, light, love, knowledge, courage, character, faith, and righteous lives will draw good women of the world, along with their families, to the church in unprecedented numbers, unquote. Now that we understand that prophecy, let me identify 4 parallels that I have drawn between the American Revolutionaries and the future covenant-keeping women of today. We are those covenant-keeping women of today. The first parallel, the American Revolutionaries were presenting a new idea. That idea was to create a country that allowed for freedom without a king. They wanted a republic. The future covenant-keeping women of today are presenting a different idea for this world's moral norm. It is to be virtuous, to keep the commandments of God. The second parallel, the American Revolutionaries were young in their years and their experience in war. The future covenant-keeping women are young in their opportunity within the world to speak directly as leaders and not just as an influence to their husband. I'm convinced that Abigail Adams is dancing in heaven over the progress of women being given the opportunity to step into leadership roles after 250 years of progress. The third parallel, the determining factor of success for the American Revolutionaries were their personalities and character. They emulated strength, courage, and determination. The future covenant-keeping women will draw good women of the world through their light, love, knowledge, courage, character, faith, and righteous lives to the church in unprecedented numbers. The fourth and final parallel, the members of the American Revolution felt their roles within the revolution were of divine providence. Sisters, it has been prophesied that we are the future covenant-keeping women referred to in President Kimball's prophecy. We are a part of divine providence to prepare for the second coming of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Isn't it amazing? The more I listened to the American Revolutionaries' experience, the more I understood that we, sisters and brothers in the gospel, are also revolutionaries. It is up to us. We are all involved in a dramatic change. Covenant-keeping women will have a direct influence on the major growth of the church. This is a dramatic change. Thus, we are all revolutionaries. How we approach our position as revolutionaries will make all the difference in our future. George Washington's Re-enlistment Speech, given on December 31st, 1776, taught us what approach we should take. He helped us to see what a privilege it is to be the very group, the chosen few, to accept this calling. Our influence is pivotal in so many children's lives. Who better to take this role than the women, the mothers of the world? We will look back at this time as one of the most valuable acts of service given in our entire existence. For this reason, sisters, I invite you to choose to step forward. Choose to be a covenant-keeping woman. Choose to follow Him, our Savior, Jesus Christ. I thank you for being with me today during this patriotic month as we celebrate our independence and the glorious cause of America. Now imagine me holding your hand as I say farewell, my friends, until we meet again.